You're listening to the Seasteading Today podcast, where we speak to entrepreneurs and researchers who are making the dream of seasteading a reality. The Seasteading Today podcast. Stop arguing and start seasteading.
Hello, Seasteaders. This is Carly Jackson, your new host of the Seasteading Today podcast. We are relaunching the podcast so that you, the seasteading community, can learn all about the active projects and aquapreneurs that will make seasteading happen in the next few years. My first guest is Joe Quirk, President and Seavangelist for the Seasteading Institute and author of Seasteading: How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians. In the interview, I mentioned to Joe my belief that the seasteading community is divided into two camps, the political and the scientific. His response, which I'm sure you'll appreciate, really changed my perspective. Joe explains that governance should be treated like technology in that we can improve it through innovation and competition. He also gives us an update on Chad and Nadia, the seasteading couple who are on the run from the Thai government. Without further ado, here's the interview with Joe Quirk. Hello, and welcome to the Seasteading Today podcast. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for inviting me, Carly.
We are relaunching this Seasteading Today podcast by interviewing many of the aquapreneurs who are featured in your book. And can you tell us how you came to write the Seasteading book?
Well, I was at Burning Man and I met Patri Friedman, and he described what seasteading was. And because I'd just been on a cruise ship about 6 weeks before, I realized that floating cities were entirely possible. I just didn't understand why someone would found a nonprofit to make it happen sooner than it would otherwise happen. And then I noticed after I went home that the seasteading logo was based on the Burning Man logo, and that really engaged my curiosity as to why a city in the desert would inspire cities on the ocean. I had to remember his name and look him up and discover his blog. And since I'd just written a book about evolution, and I understood the variation and selection that gives rise to progress in all things, Patri articulated that much of the Earth's surface is unclaimed by any nation state. This is sort of a research and development zone where we could discover better means of governance. It's a Silicon Valley approach to improving governance through startups that people can choose voluntarily. And what really caught me was the idea that if cities were modular and you could move your city blocks around, you'd have a market of governance, which would be variation by governance providers and selection by citizens. And that was a mind-blowing realization. And so I started soliciting the Seasteading Institute, saying, this can't just be some obscure idea debated among Silicon Valley economists. This needs to happen sooner than later, because I think one of the great dangers to the human race is the accelerating power of governments around the world. And the increasing surveillance states around the world. Like, we have to solve this problem. And I thought unleashing evolution in governance itself is the best way to unlock radical improvements. And I thought the best way we could make this happen is to attract 1,000 times more minds to it. So I just started soliciting the Seasteading Institute, saying, look, I'm an author. We could make this a mainstream book. Enough with the obscure academic papers. We need to tell a story that's going to attract 1,000 times more brains to making this happen. And I'm delighted to say that 6 or 7 years later, I think that has happened. I think we have attracted 1,000 times more brains to be thinking about it. And now we are basically making it happen. So, there was when I first, to my surprise, Patri himself was looking for someone to co-write a book with him. So there was a nice little confluence there. But then once we agreed to write the book, and once I got a great, literary agent, and then once we sold it to the most prestigious publisher for a large advance, it was like, yay. And then I panicked because I'm like, how am I going to make this sort of abstract idea about evolution and economics and business palatable for a mainstream audience? And it wasn't until I attended the 2012 Seasteading Conference that I met all these people I would later call aquapreneurs, some of the people you're interviewing, like Ricardo Radulovich and Neil Sims, that I realized this is the essence of a story. It's about people, it's about their struggles, it's about their obstacles, it's about their innovations. And so I would tell the story of these people trying to use seasteading to solve, one of 8 great grand challenges that humanity faces. So I wrote the book. It's inspired a lot of people, and now we're off and running to make seasteading happen.
Well, and when I first was reading the book, I was just blown away by the science. I was blown away by what growing seaweed can do for water quality, and the floating architecture that is beautiful and looks like a comfortable place to live, but is also part of a symbiotic relationship with the entire seastead and the nearby land cities. So that science part of it, I was already there ideologically, but then the science part of it convinced me that it was possible. So what was your journey as you learned about just the technical logistics of building seasteads?
So I had the same growth that you did, and I wanted to convey what my experience was in the book. So I had the privilege of being there at a moment where I was meeting these various guys before they were all going to meet in San Francisco. And they all thought they were laboring alone with a vision that they needed the world to understand. And I had the privilege of talking to all of them, like the days before they met. And then I got to be there as they all started presenting these ideas and realizing there are other people like themselves who see similar things. And what was interesting is they're all coming at it from different angles, but on the same principles of solving these same problems. Literally, a lot of them were thinking about how seaweed can reverse the ocean acidity of the world. A lot of them were thinking about fish cages on the sea. A lot of them were thinking about all these things. So I was there at this galvanizing moment when these people who all thought they were laboring alone were discovering they were part of a global community. And I'm like, okay, this is a story. I am here at the moment all these different people are meeting, and they're discovering that they're not laboring alone. They are part of a global movement. And a lot of people have already entered the zeitgeist. And so I tried to make the book about that. Like, they're discovering each other's ideas.
So how do you account for that these people working all over the world in their own sandboxes, but they're all working towards one thing? Like, why is there meaning behind that? What is behind that?
If we consult history, this just happens over and over. And as a creative writer, I like to think that I come up with new ideas. But invariably, once you popularize your ideas, you find out other people are thinking about the exact same thing, usually from a different angle. One of my favorite examples was, Darwin. Darwin was laboring for decades, assembling the evidence to present this grand unified view of how life evolves. And he was taking his time about it. He took a lot, he spent several decades compiling the evidence before he would present his hypothesis to the world. And he ended up rushing his book when he discovered somebody else was doing the same thing. So there's information in the global brain, and people have insights. And it's kind of like it's in the gestalt. It's like in the zeitgeist, and there's different people discovering it everywhere. And so I think that happened again with regard to seasteading. And I think I was lucky, the seasteading became this kind of, let's call it a platform, where people came from all over the world to present what they thought was a radical view, and discovered that half the people who showed up had the same view.
So in my mind, seasteading is always divided into two components. There's the scientific / environmentalist side of it, and then there's the governance side of it, the political ideology side of it. But they are also inextricable. Like, they have to go together, and you reveal that. I love how you reveal that in the book, where each of the scientists that you talk to states that in order to continue with developing their technology, they need more liberty in their governance structure. So can you give us some more details about that, about how people who were on the science side of it came to the governance portion of seasteading?
So the idea that there's all sorts of innovations in all these technologies, but governance is not a technology and we can't innovate there. That's the fallacy that the book seeks to dispense with. And people approach seasteading, if they don't read the book, as if, there's two sides. One is like solving environmental and social problems, and the other side is a governance problem. And the reason we think of other forms of technology as being open to innovation is because there's generally no monopoly on seaweed farms or on medical technology or on aquaculture. You can innovate as much as you want. The place where there's monopolies is in governance, and we think the way we solve problems in governance is to choose ideologies and then defeat the people we don't like and enforce our opinions on them. But no, it's all part of decentralized experimentation that engages the global brain, that unleashed, Darwin and this other guy, I can't remember his name right now, to both stumble upon the same idea at the same time in different parts of the world. So every person who seeks to push forward these innovations in the book, when they talk about their obstacles, they talk about the obsolete rules that are preventing them from what they're doing. And right now I'm editing a video that I've already shot about the first seasteading business in America, Phil Kruver's Catalina Sea Ranch, where he's growing these sustainable mussels that are better for you than the other kinds of protein we eat, and it has everything going for it, and it's even environmentally restorative. But he has to move outside California waters in order to make this happen, which engages all sorts of other federal rules that are very onerous and very expensive. But he can't do it all if he remains in California waters. Well, why isn't a state full of environmentalists, why don't they have a set of rules that allows someone like Phil to scale up his mussel farms? Well, it's because the governance structures don't advance with the technologies. And governance is a technology. A technology is fundamentally rules instantiated in stuff. So I'm speaking on this microphone. It's millions of ideas selected over time, breeding, mating. The bad ones go away, the good ones become new things until it forms this marvelous microphone. And governance is the same thing. It's an algorithm. It's an iterative process, and it's the way to advance it is to, let's just say, startups. So virtually every aquapreneur I interview eventually gets around to the problem of governance not advancing as fast as their technologies. And I think you're going to interview Neil Sims, who I think is one of the best examples of this, who he's pushed forward this technology of these buckyball-shaped fish cages that basically solves every environmental problem and improves upon it. It's like everything people would want, but the 20th century rules with regard to aquaculture that were written for fish cages that are bolted to the side of the coast that put all the poop right there on the coast and cause all kinds of environmental problems and require biofoulants and require pesticides and all these things. His version, free-floating fish cages out on the sea where the cages float with the fish, has nothing to do with that kind of technology, but he's stuck with these old rules that have prevented him from doing what he wants to do in the United States, which is part of the reason we have such a drastic seafood deficit. So if you're going to innovate in technologies, you have to innovate in governance, which is just another technology. So seasteading to me is a way to unleash innovation in the most important technology that human beings have, which is governance. And, you're going to release an interview with Michael Strong, and I think he would agree the most humanitarian effort you can make is to find ways to improve governance, because it's the main thing that's holding people back from solving 21st century problems.
Mm-hmm. So in the years since the book has been published, what changes have you seen in the seasteading movement? Has the focus changed? Have the obstacles changed?
Well, what's exciting about it is that we definitely reached outside our little seasteading libertarian tent and attracted all sorts of people to get involved. So people across the political spectrum have gotten involved since we've found more accurate ways of describing what this represents to the world. It's a shame that people are so politically divisive that they have to put this in some political box. And since it can't fit in the only two we have, it has to be made into a pariah in their minds. But in reality, it's such a deep solution that it gets beyond these political divisions. And it's applicable to everyone's ideology. As a matter of fact, the book opens with the proposition, what if you could, the way to solve political problems is to empower your political enemies to go try their own systems voluntarily, and if they fail, they pay the price. And if they succeed, then they can attract more people to live there, and then they don't enforce their views on you. Seasteading is a way to make real all ideologies, and then they don't have to be ideologies anymore. They can be actual experiments in reality. The only reason we have ideologies is because we need to, join teams and defeat other people. But my wife and I disagree about Pepsi and Coke, but we don't form ideologies about it because we both have choice. Mm-hmm. And the more choice we have, the less we need ideologies. So the only thing, in my opinion, the last obstacle holding seasteading back, I think ocean builders have solved the engineering problem, which is a problem of bringing the price down. That's solved. The average middle-class person can now afford their own seastead. The wave problem, the biorock problem, the seaweed problem, all these things, I think blockchain will solve the governance problem. The last remaining obstacle is widespread misunderstanding about what seasteading represents. If the public can be educated, this can be unleashed all over the world immediately. So that's what you and I are devoted to.
And what stops people from wanting to be a seasteader? What are the most common objections?
Well, Mark Twain is credited with saying a lie will spread around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. Mm-hmm. So many stories came straight out of the gate at the very founding of the Seasteading Institute, which is a private islands for billionaires to create their evil islands of selfishness and sneer at the rest of us. And it's quite amazing how it's been so difficult to get out from under that. I cite as an example when the press talks about the repetition machine that is the lamestream press. So when the press talks about seasteading, they often say, Peter Thiel funded seasteading. Peter Thiel funded seasteads. They don't mention my name. They don't mention Patrick Friedman's name. They don't mention Randy's name. They don't mention Ricardo's name, not your name, not Michael Strong's name. They always mention Peter Thiel's name. Now, I've been involved with seasteading for 7 years. I still have not met Peter Thiel. I admire Peter Thiel. I'm very grateful he co-founded the Seasteading Institute with Patrick Friedman.
Wait, but he co-founded it, or he just was an early donor?
He's both. He was a co-founder with Patri. So he met with, he read Patri's blog, had a private meeting, and said, yes, we need to research this frontier. let's found a research institute together, and it should be a nonprofit. So he was the first most generous donor for several years at the beginning, which really got it started. But that caused everyone, what political tribe are they in? Now we're putting that in that box. We're only seeing this through a lens of tribalism. And seasteading isn't an ideology, it's a technology. So here it is, all these years later, and Peter was the co-founder of the Institute, the early, most generous donor, but he's an early stage guy. He supports things. That's my analysis of what he does is he gets in early, he supports something, and then he sees if that causes other people to get involved. And then he moves on and supports other things. He's started things early. He doesn't want seasteaders to just rely on him. And we've since found other donors and a much wider community. And I'm very happy about it, but he's not funding private businesses. He's not doing any of that, but the press just keeps repeating it. And the best way to laugh at the mainstream press is to become the subject of it. So virtually everything that's reported about seasteading contains inaccuracies and repetitions of things that aren't true. And I would love for Peter to get re-involved. I'd love for him to become a donor again. I'd love to meet him someday and ask him why he co-founded the Seasteading Institute. I admire him a lot. Watched a lot of his talks and books. I loved his recent interview where he talks about seasteading for a bit. But it's not something funded and driven by Peter Thiel, and yet the press always repeats that it is.
So the press has been very busy talking about ocean builders in Thailand. Can you tell us at this point, July 5th, 2019, what are your reflections on ocean builders in Thailand?
Well, they were volunteers with Blue Frontiers, the company that was trying to build seasteads in French Polynesia that I co-founded with a bunch of seasteaders, including the executive team at the Seasteading Institute. And Chad and Nadia actually lived on the atoll where we thought we were going to build seasteads, and they were scouting it out, they were checking it out. And when they realized it looked like French Polynesia just wasn't moving forward with approving a sea zone, they're engineering type people. They're screw it, let's do it type people. And they had done a lot of research, and they found that the Andaman Sea off the coast of Thailand, where Nadia lives and where Chad lives, could be a good place to do this. So Ocean Builders was co-founded by a German aerospace engineer, and they found ways to make it sturdy and inexpensive and affordable for the average person. And it's the size of my office that I'm in right now. It was a tiny little log cabin, at least 13 miles off the shore, that was basically an experiment in engineering to demonstrate that it worked, which they achieved. And nobody involved thought that there would be any reaction whatsoever from the Thai Navy. It was completely out of the blue and shocked everyone. So I'm happy to say that they remain safe. And I'm happy to say that Ocean Builders is moving forward with new, improved designs. The one that was made famous by our documentary was just a prototype. And the new ones being designed right now are much more beautiful. And I recommend people check out ocean.builders. And I think there's a lot of things to talk about, but I think the reaction of the Thai Navy is completely unique and not a measure of how other countries will react to a floating cabin outside their territorial waters, especially if we secure a deal with a host nation first, which is part of what I'm working on now.
And so tell us more about that and the progress you hope to see from the seasteading movement in the next year or so?
Well, we need to secure what I would like to do. There are several fronts. And the thing about seasteading is it's not us doing it. It's now several companies. And I can name them. There's Ventive Float House making one type of structure that will probably start in the San Francisco Bay. Check them out, Ventive Float House. There's On Hand Agrarian, which is making another type of structure in Singapore and plans to, they're basically reef blocks and plans to float these out onto the equator in international waters. It's a long-term plan. There's Blue Frontiers, the company I'm a part of, which is negotiating with island and coastal nations for a sea zone, which would be a special economic zone plus, which have provided lots of prosperity for countries that host them around the world. Tom Bell has counted more than 4,500 around the world. So people don't even realize there's a bottom-up revolution in governance happening in the form of sea zones. And the United States itself has 276 free trade zones. So it's broken out in what I call a pox of experimentation. Now imagine if you could float these offshore, you could negotiate for considerably more autonomy. So that's what we're trying to do. I don't want to name the countries yet, but we're in negotiations with at least 2 right now. And Ocean Builders has already negotiated with yet another country. And I might be forgetting a seasteading company or 2. So it's a decentralized global effort at this point with various technologies and various strategies to make seasteading happen. And I haven't even talked about the Brazilian idea to build a city in international waters. So we've engaged the creativity of people on 4 continents at this point.
Yeah, I think it's funny. Sometimes people contact the Seasteading Institute and they ask us for direction or a top-down formula for getting a seastead out in the water. And it's hard from my perspective as handling the communications for the Seasteading Institute, because what I would like to see is creativity and innovation and all these unique projects kind of speak to the decentralized ideals of seasteading. And what would you like to see from people who want to be involved and make a seastead happen in the near future?
Well, I'd like to see people founding more companies and developing more technologies and convincing their friends that this is not crazy. Seasteading is not crazy. The governments we have now are crazy. And so this is the new frontier for sanity. And I'm currently excited for people to share our Tough Questions Answered video series, because I think one of the things that stops people from investigating whether seasteading can work is the basic objections like, well, what about pirates? What about waves? What about tsunamis? And what about hurricanes? And there are quick, simple answers to those questions and interesting ones. And we've put them in a series of videos because I realize asking people to read an entire book isn't the best way to answer these objections. So you can look up, seasteading, are they just tax havens? And then you can get a 2 to 3 minute answer in a nice little video that I made with Jackson Sullivan. So what I want is more creativity. And you are correct that the Seasteading Institute is a 2-person nonprofit composed of you and me. We are not able to fund people's companies. We are not investors. We are evangelists for seasteading, and we spread the word and inspire people. And then people bring their creative ideas to us. And we will do what we can to connect you to the right people. But we're not the ones that can build seasteads. We're the ones that can inspire other people to do so.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
There are many things I could say, but I'm curious, what would you like to see people that reach out to the Seasteading Institute do?
Yeah, spread the word, share the ideas. It's hard sometimes when there's a language barrier. So, we have some volunteers who will translate YouTube videos, which I find very helpful. And I saw a real response to that. We had someone translate a few of our videos into Portuguese, and then all of a sudden people in Brazil were watching our videos. So for people who aren't at a place to start a seasteading business, helping us communicate is helpful, and finding ways to communicate to new audiences, especially audiences that don't speak English, is very helpful. So, and giving us some goodwill, because a lot of the noise you get online, which is where I spend most of my time, a lot of that noise can be very negative. And so whenever I see something that is supportive or thoughtful or just questioning in our many social media forums, I want to support that and keep those conversations happening, because we know that conversations online is what led to the founding of Ocean Builders and led to that first affordable seastead in the Andaman Sea. So I think that those conversations can be very useful, as well as people actually building technology.
Yeah, here. We should send an official shout out for anyone that can translate our videos into the languages they're experts at. Is really appreciated. Mm-hmm. And yes, the network out there in the world is the thing that's going to make seasteading happen.
All right. Well, thank you for being the first guest on the relaunch of our podcast, Joe.
I can't wait to hear the updates from all the people I interviewed for the book. So I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of your interviews.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Carly.
The Seasteading Today podcast is produced by John Bush. Your host is Carly Jackson. Send feedback and questions to podcast@seasteading.org. To support the podcast and the Seasteading mission, go to seasteading.org/donate. If you'd like to learn more, read the book, Seasteading: How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast feed, and we'll save you a spot on a seastead.